You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for October 18th, 2019. This week, the Nobel Prize, more on the XL trial controversy, the costs of cardiac tests, familial hypercholesterolemia, and burnout. First off, I want to say thanks for the many comments I got on the last podcast. I loved hearing from you on the content. Today, I will begin with the Nobel Prize. Medscape covered the Nobel Prize in Medicine, which was awarded to a British-American trio for cell and oxygen research. Obviously, this is an important area of basic research, but once again, for practicing clinicians like me, the more pertinent Nobel Prize is the one for economics. Now, I say once again because Daniel Kahneman's Nobel in economics, which he won for his work on the biases inherent in human decision-making, is vital to our work in helping people make decisions on medical care. But this year, the Nobel in economics went to Esther Duflo, her husband, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kremer, all from Cambridge, Mass. You might wonder, why is an economic Nobel Prize the lead story on a cardiology podcast? Well, it's because all three academics are at the vanguard of the randomista movement. Yes, that's right. Their work in using randomized controlled trials to determine the best social interventions in poor countries won them the Nobel Prize. This is central to our field of clinical medicine because, like the economist, we desperately want to help people we serve. But my friends, good intentions and common sense are not enough. Let me read you two short phrases from one of their papers on an intervention designed to graduate people from poverty in 6 low-income countries. Quote, about half the eligible participants were assigned to treatment and half to control. Then this, quote, at the end of the intervention, we found statistically significant impacts on all 10 key outcomes or indices. Like Kahneman's Nobel, this year's prize will end up being crucial for the advance of clinical medicine. For if we want to help our patients, we need more than stories, more than plausibility statements like this treatment should work, and more than observational studies that are fatally confounded by selection bias. We need to do what Duflo, Banerjee, and Kremer teach. It is so simple, really. Quote, about half the eligible patients were assigned to treatment and half to control. I realize RCTs are not perfect. Consumers of RCTs, clinicians, patients need to be alert for spin, and it takes extreme wisdom to apply the results from trials which give average effects in groups of people to the patient in front of you. And RCTs are not needed for everything, say a femur fracture. But for most clinical and policy decisions, RCTs are way worth the investment. Imagine for a moment if, instead of implementing the hospital readmissions reduction program across the board, we assign half the hospitals to an active arm and the other half to control. We would now know if the programs worked. Period. The endless dissections of observational studies could stop. Imagine if instead of sending millions of Americans into scanners to measure coronary artery calcium, which will discover oodles of incidentalomas and label people with a disease, we did an RCT where half of the patients got scans, half got medical therapy based on the pooled cohort equation, and then we counted up MIs and death and joy at 5 to 10 years. And my last example comes from this week's New England Journal of Medicine. Both antiplatelet drugs, ticagrelor and prasugrel, look better than clopidogrel after PCI for STEMI. But if German investigators had not decided to do an RCT, we would not know that prasugrel was the superior agent. Second topic today is more on the XL trial controversy. Speaking of being careful with the interpretation of RCTs in clinical evidence, last week I spent many minutes dissecting the 5-year results of the XL trial, which compared left main PCI to CABG. Veteran journalist Steve Stiles has a very nice recap about this controversy, and I would urge you to read his summary, but not get too caught up in the accusations between investigators about manipulating data. The important stuff is how to interpret the 5-year trial results. On a balanced and thoughtful thread on Twitter this week, heart surgeon Patrick Myers called for New England Journal to retract the paper. His reasoning has nothing to do with the personal accusations. Instead, his reasoning relates to 1, the problem of using an enzyme-based definition of peri-procedural MI in the primary endpoint. As I cited last week, the paper by Mark Rule et al. In Circulation clearly shows that how one defines MI has a direct influence on the number of post-procedure MIs one detects. Steve Stiles even quotes noted statistician Stuart Pocock on this matter. The surgeon's Dr. Patrick Myers' second point is that if you count only non-procedural MIs, the results strongly favor CABG. His third, and I think strongest point, is that mortality in the XL trial is clearly going the wrong way for PCI. And last week I misspoke a bit. I said that the 38% higher death rate in the PCI group did not reach significance. It did. It did because the lower bound of the confidence interval was 1.03. Myers also points to the increasing separation of the death rates over time. In other words, the Kaplan-Meier curves are getting wider and wider. To his credit, Dr. Greg Stone, the PI of XL, engaged, and he tweeted a slide with meta-analytic results of other left main PCI versus CABG studies, and the totality of the evidence does not suggest higher rates of death. So, I don't know about retraction of a study. That is usually reserved for fraud, but it is really, really hard to look at the results of this trial and agree with the conclusion that was written in the New England Journal that there is no difference between these two therapies. Here's a case where an open data set would allow a formal reanalysis, and I think that reanalysis would likely show different results. Third topic is the cost of cardiac testing. Now, the U.S. healthcare system offers many lessons in how not to set policies. Consider the utter folly of paying doctors for a test based on the building in which the test is done. A little more than a decade ago, payers were concerned about the increasing numbers of non-invasive cardiac tests that were being done. Now, fast thinking here has it that cardiologists make their high salaries from interventional procedures. Yes, procedures do pay well, but less well known is that non-invasive testing, echoes, stress tests, and nuclear scans, these act somewhat like printing presses for money. Non-invasive testing is the petrol that drives the cardiology practice in the U.S. And overuse of these tests flies under the radar because they are non-invasive and they're sold to unsuspecting patients as thorough care. Consider that nuclear camera or the whirling sounds of a Doppler echo, these put out huge caring signals. Patients who have these tests feel cared for during the test. Well, around 2005, payers had an idea. They would cut reimbursement for these tests if they were done in the doctor's office. They left reimbursement for the procedures done in hospitals unchanged. Not long after these changes, increasing numbers of cardiologists sold their practice to hospitals and agreed to be employed. If your cardiologist's office was attached to a hospital, you might have seen a sign go up in the doctor's office saying that, quote, "You are now entering a hospital setting." University of Colorado cardiologist Dr. Fred Masudi and his colleagues decided to look at the results of this reimbursement change. They used the sample of Medicare claims from 1999 to 2015. Essentially, they compared the cost of testing done in the hospital versus private offices. This was an observational study, but to get closer to making causal claims, they used the cost from 3 HMOs as a control group. HMOs could be a control group because reimbursement for testing in the HMO was not dependent on the location of the test. A student of human nature easily predicts their results. Masudi and colleagues found that the ratio of hospital to private payments increased from 1.05, essentially no difference in 2005, to 2.3 in 2015. And this change resulted in the proportion of cardiac tests performed in hospitals to increase from 21% in 2008 to 43% in 2015. And this increase strongly correlated with the site-specific changes in payment rates for the test. Of course it did. In the HMO group, where there was no difference in payments, the proportion of testing done in hospitals actually declined from 18% to 15% over the same time period. JAMA Internal Medicine published this important paper, and Drs. Jose Figueroa and Karen Joint-Maddox wrote an excellent editorial. The editorialist outlined 3 unintended consequences of this policy. First, total costs for cardiac tests actually increased because docs and hospitals are not stupid. Of course they shifted more of these tests to pricier settings. Second unintended consequence is that Americans' out-of-pocket cost increased. And third, the change in reimbursement drove the consolidation of private practices into hospital-employed practices. Consolidation occurred because overhead to maintain a nuclear camera and echo machines and the personnel to run them increased to the point that with lower reimbursement, doctors did what they had to maintain their salary. They sold their practices to hospitals. Now, time will tell whether or not doctors being employed by 1 or 2 large hospital systems in each city is a good or bad thing for patient care. Put me down as not optimistic. The editorialists also tell us about movements that try to go back to site-neutral payments. I doubt this will happen. It would crush revenue streams of hospitals. I agree with the editorialist's proposal for another solution to the problem, and it's one I hope for nearly every day. That is, give us X amount of dollars to treat a patient with a condition. Then you will see the rates of unneeded testing plummet. For instance, if this happened, point-of-care ultrasound would quickly become mainstream. Here I could get an assessment of the left ventricle valve function without doing a $1,000 echocardiogram. Finally, an obvious and incontrovertible conclusion from this study is that policymakers must consider unintended consequences of their policies. Imagine if instead of just decreeing this change for all, they did what our Nobel laureates advised. They studied the policy change in randomized controlled trials. Next topic is familial hypercholesterolemia and its broader lessons. New England Journal of Medicine published an interesting observational study on FH this week. This was a 20-year follow-up of statin therapy in children. The original study was from an RCT at the University of Amsterdam looking at the 2-year efficacy and safety of pravastatin in kids with FH. The study included 214 individuals, and 98% had genetically confirmed FH, and they were on statin therapy. The authors of this 20-year study looked at 3 things: progression of carotid intima-medial thickness, cardiovascular events, and cardiovascular death. They also compared these findings in 95 unaffected siblings and 156 affected parents. The parents served as a control of sorts because they had lived many years before statins were available. There were 3 main findings over the 2 decades of this study. Number 1, not surprising, mean LDL in patients decreased by 32% from the baseline levels. Second, in treated patients, the mean progression of carotid intima-media thickness did not progress any more than the unaffected siblings. And this was the big one. The cumulative incidence of cardiovascular events and death from cardiovascular causes at 39 years of age was lower among the patients with familial hypercholesterolemia than among their affected parents. Get these differences: 1% versus 26% for CV events and 0% versus 7% for CV death. The outcome findings of that look stunning in the Kaplan-Meier curves. Now, the authors, to their credit, spend 3 large paragraphs on the limitations of this study. It's observational. For instance, did the lower rates of cardiovascular events in the treated patients with FH compared with their parents occur because of lower LDL levels or because of temporal trends in cardiovascular care? How accurate are carotid measurements? Note that these measurements are in millimeters. And there was also a fair amount of missing data in this study. Yet, as observational studies go, this one is neat. The autosomal dominant nature of FH allows for some interesting comparator arms, like the siblings without the disease. And using affected parents who had less exposure to lower LDL is also kind of a cool comparator. The second reason for highlighting this study is that it aligns well with the Mendelian randomization studies. You know, nature's RCTs. These studies show that longer exposure to lower LDL levels leads to fewer cardiovascular events. And taken together, therefore, these sorts of studies underscore the public health importance of fostering healthy living beginning as early as possible. That's why I think that this study transcends FH. It strengthens the notion that long-term exposure to high levels of lipoprotein increases the odds of having cardiovascular events. The final topic today is burnout. At a conference of medical group managers, Senator Bill Cassidy, a gastroenterologist, made some interesting comments. His key message was that doctors should not look to Washington, D.C. to reduce administrative burden. Our Medscape Features column describes Cassidy's talk and explores his ideas on aligning financial and health-related incentives. Like this, for instance, quote, "If you were judged on outcomes versus processes, you'd shave down your administrative overhead," he said. That's more time to talk to the patient versus checking one more box. Of course, he is right, but this is fantasy. Administrative bloat in healthcare is there because there is money to be made from it. His candor about not looking to DC to reduce the burdens that lead to burnout does us a favor. Now, I may be wrong about my ideas on burnout, and I may make some listeners mad, but I've changed. I've decided that I really like practicing electrophysiology and using my skills to help people. Being a doctor still has a ton of meaning. Sometimes it doesn't show on a spreadsheet, but our patients know. Yes, I wish we had less admin nonsense, more autonomy, and surely a better electronic record. So my revelation and change is that it seems nutty to fuss about stuff I cannot control. For instance, it's pointless to complain about how bad the EHR is. It's horrific. And, by the way, to my young listeners, it's likely that way because central control and a lack of a free market. It's worth studying the history of how exactly 2 vendors became dominant, and it's not their user interface. My change is that slowly but surely I've decided that to keep doing a job that has great meaning, I have to figure out ways to make the EHR less horrific. And I think it's possible. Templates, short writing, and placing a screen where both the patient and I can see it helps. I also try to say out loud to patients as I click on echo images, for instance, "Hey, showing you these pictures is one thing I like about the computer." Same deal with administrative bloat. Of course, many of the quality measures we are forced to comply with actually decrease quality. That's frustrating. Thinking about the hubris of policymakers gives me palpitations. But if we're going to help people with serious illnesses, we have to figure out workarounds or get more efficient at checkboxes. In sum, I think, the wins from this job, when a patient quits smoking or loses weight, when an arrhythmia is vanquished, when a paced QRS is gorgeously narrow, these wins still outweigh the negatives. Make no mistake, advocacy is important, and to the advocators, I say, please keep fighting. I hope you make things better, but until then, I will do the best I can in the system we have. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, please, if you like this podcast, consider subscribing, giving us a rating, and writing us a review on whatever app you use. That way other people can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the heart.org on Medscape.